Good. Ah, lovely. Yes, I see maps now. Okay, perfect. All right, so good evening, everybody here in the room at the University of Greenwich, and good evening those who are joining us online. My name is Maria Arce, the head of the Center for Research in Language and Heritage, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you today to Dr. Laurence White. He's a very dear colleague from the University of Newcastle with a spectacular background in both linguistics and psychology. So Laurence is one of these greatest stories that we linguists love to speak about, because he's got a bachelor's degree from Oxford in psychology, but a PhD in linguistics, which shows the direction of travel, from the University of Edinburgh. He's very widely published about prosody and characteristics of language and sound. He's got, I really encourage you and invite you to take a look at his profile. He's got very interesting publications about artificial intelligence and the sound that they choose for these artificial agents and why they do that, the happily sounds and etc., which I think maybe some of that will overlap with what we are going to be hearing today. His research also shows these applications that linguistics has in the sphere of health, which I think is a great example for students around the world, because this illustrates how very nitty-gritty linguistics finds the very good applications, but what we are bringing to the applications is great linguistics in essence. So he's also very dear for the University of Greenwich because he co-supervised a PhD dissertation with us, the dissertation of C.U. Chen, which was very well received a couple of years ago. So we are looking forward to hearing your talk, Laurence. Thank you very much for making it, and thank you. All yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the invitation, for that very kind introduction. And thank you also to Nancy for organising the logistics of getting me here. And thanks for coming in the room and online. So the genesis of this project was actually goes back a few years when I was working in Plymouth University, actually in the psychology department. So now based in speech and language sciences, and we're training people to be speech and language therapists. But before I was teaching in a sort of conventional psychology department. And one of the nice things we had there in Plymouth psychology was a nice big common room where we'd go and sit as colleagues and have a chat over lunch. So I was a fairly regular lunch person there. And I think that the whole project got going over a lunchtime chat. And I think it's actually a nice example of the importance of just getting together in universities and having those casual contacts, which sometimes don't happen if we're just meeting over Zoom. So I was move that forward. There we go. So I was having lunch one day and having a chat with one of my colleagues in Plymouth, Michael Highland, a member of the psychology department at that time. And he's very interested in psychotherapy, of various sorts of psychotherapy, and looking at the effectiveness of psychotherapy. Very often at lunch, we did not talk about work. But as on this occasion, it just so happened that he was telling me about some project he'd been involved in recently. And he said one of the interesting things about psychotherapy is that there are many different sorts of psychotherapy. And it's very hard to say which one is going to be most effective for any particular condition. But what they do know is that the relationship between the therapist and the patient and the sort of affiliated bond between therapist and patient is really important across the board. But it's very hard to work out if there is going to be a strong affiliative relationship. And sometimes you can have months of psychotherapy and you don't get any outcome. And it's kind of like, we wish we could have known in advance that this relationship just wasn't working. So it's an interesting discussion. The term therapeutic alliance is often used, which is sometimes defined as a collaborative relationship between therapist and patient. So that's agreement on treatment goals, on treatment tasks, but importantly, the formation of a positive emotional bond. There's another recent definition I found: a working alliance, investment by both therapist and client in the therapy, empathetic resonance, and mutual affirmation. So really like interpersonal relationships here, rather than just the sort of dynamics of the therapy per se. And crucially, this therapeutic alliance, broadly defined, is often associated with positive treatment outcomes, irrespective of the actual type of psychotherapy. So I was very interested in this. This is not my background. I have a psychology degree, but we didn't do much about psychotherapy. It was a small part of one module in the degree program. I'm not in any way an expert on psychotherapy, or indeed on depression in general. But what I'm interested in is prosody. My brother-in-law is fond of saying, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I thought, prosody. And prosody, rhythm and timing and melody of speech, essentially the music of speech, immediately struck me as being potentially very relevant here, because we know that the dynamics of prosody in interaction, so when two or more people are talking, are indicative of mutual liking and also associated with positive dialogue outcomes. So there's an awful lot of research on this. And I thought, well, could we apply this in the therapy context? And that was really the origin of the idea. So Michael wasn't actually working on a relevant project at the time, but he put me in touch with another colleague, Ben Wally, also at Plymouth University, who was involved in a randomized control trial of a particular sort of psychotherapy treating people with long-standing depression. And this was led by Thomas Lynch, then at the University of Southampton, and Rowley Hempel, formerly of the University of Southampton as well, who devised what they called radically open dialectical behavioural therapy. Full disclosure, declaration of interest for them, they are actually run a company that sort of promotes this or is developing this type of therapy. So they'd already run this randomized controlled trial looking at this sort of therapy for people with long-standing depression. And they're obviously comparing with control group. But what that involved was making recordings of lots of therapy sessions, so lots of interactions between patients and therapists. And they'd all been video recorded, and I thought, well, can we look at the prosody there? So we did a bit of preliminary work when I was at Plymouth, but shortly afterwards, I then moved to Newcastle in 2018. And I was involved in undergraduate supervision, as we often are, in degrees with a research component. And one of my very first students, Hannah Grimes, took on this project and did a really fantastic job with it, and actually did some extra work beyond the project after she'd finished. And what I'm going to be talking about today is really the product of the work that Hannah did under my supervision. And we've got a paper which is just about ready to submit, so hopefully that'll be going in soon, which is reporting all this. This is one of the papers about the original randomized control trial of the therapy itself, in case you're interested. So, I didn't realize it was touchscreen, right? So that would be useful. So this is Lynch et al. In the British Journal of Psychiatry. So this is not our focus today. So we're not interested in the efficacy or otherwise of this therapy, although obviously that's important in itself. What we're interested in is looking at the indices of the therapeutic relationship that we might find in the prosody of these recordings. Now, prosody in depression, it's always, even if you don't know what prosody is, when you hear someone who sounds depressed, essentially you will think it's the prosody that's doing it, that's making them sound depressed. So the characterization of someone with depression might be low pitch, reduced pitch range, relatively slow articulation rate, frequent pauses as well, maybe relatively short utterances with quite long pauses and variable length pauses. Now, obviously, not everyone who is clinically depressed will necessarily sound depressed, and sometimes people might sound depressed when they're not, but there is a clear overall view of depressed speech. Actually, when you look into the literature on this, there's a bit of variability with regard to pitch measures. So there's pitch, so our fundamental frequency of our voices, varies a lot between individuals and also varies within individuals over time and depending on mood, fatigue, excitement, etc., etc. So pitch measures actually turn out to be not that clear-cut between studies. This may also relate to methodological differences. Obviously, participant sex is important here. So typically female speakers tend to have higher pitch than male speakers. Severity of depression, a big factor that's not generally controlled in studies is how depressed people are. Obviously, medication would also be important there. And the method of elicitation. Are you getting people with depression just to read sentences, or are you actually looking at how they're producing spontaneous speech? Speech rate it seems to be pretty clearly a strong indication of depressed speech. So the rate at which people produce speech sounds is negatively correlated with depression severity. The more depressed people are, the slower they tend to speak. Also, as I've already mentioned, so pause length tends to be longer, there tends to be more variable pauses with more severe depression. That's very much focusing on the individual and at a particular time. So we know that individuals vary in their speech production. Obviously, as people develop depression, recover from depression, there's going to be variability. Day-to-day fluctuations in mood, we all experience that. Sometimes we just sound more up than others. Sometimes we talk to someone on the phone and people say, are you okay? I think I'm fine, but I'm projecting something that's not okay. But also conversational dynamics. So how people interact with each other has a huge impact at many levels of speech production. So prosody, but also the words we choose, the syntactic structures we use, the gestures we use. I've got a couple of little examples of that here. So this wasn't quite working before, hopefully it'll work now. So this is Gillian Anderson, you're probably familiar with, the actor Gillian Anderson. She was actually born in the US but brought up in the UK and is clearly bidialectal. But the degree to which she speaks in one her accent or another depends on who she's talking to. So I've got a little example here. Hopefully this will work. Can you hear that? Is it on here? Oh, you can just turn that. Yeah, that's probably enough. Thanks. So here we go. Okay, and then similarly, it's hard to believe that's the same person, but it is. So that's Gillian Anderson. In the first case, she's talking to an English person. In the second case, to an American person. In the second case, you can clearly hear the rhoticity in her. So she's got that word final R there. But also the prosody is clearly distinct. So that's a nice example. Now, this is Gillian Anderson has these two dialects, but we all do it to some extent. I know I'm from the north, but occasionally I catch myself when I'm talking to someone from the south, I might say Bath rather than Bath, and then feel like a real traitor to my roots. But we do it. We do modify how we speak in various ways. That's also true at the gestural level. So one final example. Hopefully this isn't too loud now. Oh no. So I saw this and I didn't recognise anybody. I recognised James Corden, but I didn't know the other ones. I was really perturbed to realise that's Christian Slater. And I remember him like being a little boy in The Name of the Rose. Anyway, it just made me feel old. That's Christian Slater, and I can't remember the other person. Anyway, they're having a chat about some film, and they're talking about some person called Chad, and they use this one of them uses this strange phrase, meat-eating Chad, and then the other one does. But they imitate each other in terms of use of words, but also in terms of gestures as well. It's clear that not only the phrasing, but also the gesturing is like one of them is imitating the other. And this is really symptomatic of all kinds of interactions. And we tend to do it more when these interactions are going well. I would say thank you very much to Lotta Ike at York University of York, who's an expert on these sort of conversational dynamics, and pointed me to these. In fact, gave me these examples, which are very nice. Now, often it's more subtle than this, but it goes on all the time. So articulation rate maybe would be less evident in a sort of just side-by-side example, but that very commonly tends to converge between speakers as conversation progresses. So articulation rate gets closer, and is also a sign of positive affiliation. So it tends to get closer if people feel good about the nature of the interaction. Pitch as well, pitch range may show convergence. It can be affected by obviously speaker sex, so you may be more likely to get pitch range, pitch convergence in terms of average pitch or range of pitch if the two speakers have the same sex, but also it's influenced by things like mutual liking and the context of the dialogue. But you do see convergence there as well. So, as already mentioned, we were wondering here if we could see, amongst other things, by looking at these therapeutic dialogues, whether we could see some convergence as an index of a positive therapeutic relationship. What they call in the psychotherapy area, therapeutic alliance. This side of things is very exploratory here, because we didn't set it up we didn't set up the recordings initially, but this was kind of our underlying question was, can we see something in the prosody early on that predicts positive outcomes later? But more generally, we wanted to know, looking at these patient therapy interactions, do depressed patients show the expected differences from therapists in terms of prosodic features? So articulation rate, median pitch, pitch range, pitch standard deviation. Now, there are more sophisticated measures of prosody, which we could use and we may well use in the future, but we wanted to keep it simple for now because these are the measures that people have typically looked at in the past when they're looking at sort of just the depressed person themselves. What's their pitch like? What's their articulation rate like? So now we're looking at it in interaction, but we want to start by looking at these same features. Is there evidence of relationship between depression severity and prosodic features? So are more depressed people showing slower articulation rate, but also with regard to the therapist as well? Does the level of depression patient influence what the therapist is doing in terms of prosody? And then finally, as just mentioned, can we find evidence of prosodic convergence, people getting more similar in some prosodic dimension, as a predictor of therapy outcomes? And obviously you can see that would be very useful if it were the case. Our patient group then came from this randomized controlled trial. They're all people with long-standing depression. They've had a poor response to medication or psychological treatment. They're on medication for depression, but obviously they are still suffering from depression. In this case, this particular patient group, 80% of them have associated personality disorders. In particular, many of them are characterized by what's called over-controlled personality disorder, you can see some features there: cognitive behavioural rigidity, restrained emotional expression, limited social interaction, and problems of sort of trust within relationships. This obviously has implications for prosody. Another strand of my work that Maria alluded to with Laurence, another PhD student at Plymouth, is looking at cues to trustworthiness. And we found that there are prosodic cues which can mediate how trustworthy you'll find an interlocutor. So both people with these sort of personality disorders may well have, notwithstanding the depression, differences in prosody from typical users, and they also have differences in the perception of prosody as well. So this therapy actually, is a quote from one of the papers about this therapy, is the first treatment known to target deficits in social signalling as the main problem underlying over-controlled emotional loneliness. And obviously one way that we signal our engagement socially, and one way that we're interpreted as being engaged and trustworthy, friendly, etc., is through prosody. So we took a subset of dialogues from this behavioural therapy trial. There were lots and lots of therapy sessions, typically 27, 28, 29 therapy sessions, and each of them was maybe an hour long. We didn't have the resources to measure all of those. So we took a subset of them. It's okay. As mentioned, these are people with treatment-resistant depression, so it's at least moderately severe and persistent. Their score, for those people who know about these things, they're scoring more than 15, at least 15 on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, and they're on antidepressant medication. We took the audio tracks for our prosodic analyses from the videos that we used to examine the dynamics of the therapy in general. So this is very much secondary data analysis. Our outcome measure in terms of therapy sort of success was the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. So it's another measure of depression, of current level of depression, and higher is more depressed. And I'll come back to that. So the PHQ-9 will be referenced later. Essentially, people with higher scores than that are more depressed. And they took these both at the start of therapy and at the end of therapy. So there are 40 people with depression, 26 female, and 9 therapists, 8 of whom were female. Each therapist was talking to between 2 and 5 of the patients within our subset. So, yeah, therapists had a sort of one-to-many relationship with the patients here. There were 23 female-female pairs, and most of our pitch analyses will focus on the female-female pairs for obvious reasons, that there's more control over differences in pitch when you have female speakers, given that male voices typically are significantly lower in pitch than female voices. As I said, we'd love to have analysed right the way through, and I'm working on getting resources to actually do that. We decided to start by looking at the very outset of therapy and the end of therapy, so month 1 and month 7, of typically 29 sessions, sometimes 27, 28, but we took the first and last sessions. We didn't want to go into the therapeutic recordings and start listening to them and picking particular utterances out on the basis of what they sounded like, because we didn't want to be choosing things that might be prosodically distinctive. So we had a very mechanistic way of extracting our utterances. We broke the whole therapy session into 4-minute chunks, and then we took the first chunk and the last chunk, and we looked for the first time that we had 3 seconds of one speaker followed by 3 seconds of another speaker, and called that an exchange. So it was very mechanistic. We didn't want any subjectivity in how we chose our interactions. For obvious reasons, we don't want to be influencing the outcomes there. People generally recovered somewhat over the course of therapy. And so these are people with long-standing depression, and on average, even by the end of this 6 months of therapy, they still had some evidence of depression, but there was a general recovery. So PHQ-9 scores are around 20. This is all dialogue pairs, and these are the female-only subset. This is a subset of those. They're around 20 on the PHQ-9 at the start, and around 14 or 15 at the end. Some people actually had 0 scores at the end. So some people were essentially depression-free by the end, but some people whose scores had not changed at all. But overall, there was a decrease in depression, and that statistically reliable decrease. For people who are interested in statistics, then we did the sort of statistical analysis that expect us to do these days, a mixed effect linear regression analysis with 3 independent factors, each of them 2 levels. So speaker was patient or therapist, session was first or last, sample early or late within the session. So remember, the session is the very first session of therapy, the very last session of therapy, and then we sampled these exchanges of at least 3 seconds of each speaker, one after the other, early in the session, late within the session. So we wanted to look for evidence of changes over the whole of therapy, but also within the session. On our prosodic measures. So medium pitch, we only looked at for female-female dialogues for obvious reasons already stated. Pitch range and pitch standard deviation. We looked at these for mixed, for all dialogues. Again, we think the data are more reliable for the all-female set. Pitch range, you typically knock off the very top and very bottom to get rid of outliers. Suddenly your voice goes a bit squeaky or something like that. So we just take this 80% range in the middle, pitch standard deviation. Articulation rate is syllables per second, excluding pauses. So speech rate is typically defined including pauses, but here we took out any pause longer than 200 milliseconds, and then the rest of the utterance, it was the length of the utterance divided, or the number of syllables divided by the length of the utterance. Again, really drilling down into the details of our linear regression models. We had a random intercept of the patient-therapist pairing. We didn't have random slopes because they didn't work in the models, and we used model comparisons, the likelihood ratio test to assess these effects and the interactions. For those of you who like statistics, you're probably thinking, yeah, obviously we did that, and otherwise we did what people typically do these days for these sort of analyses. Now, I'm not going into details about this table, so don't worry about what's on this, apart from the margins. So we've got articulation rate, pitch range, pitch standard deviation. These are for the full set of 40 patient-therapist pairs. First session, last session, early, late within the session. And then we've got means and standard deviations for our different measures. It doesn't really matter because essentially there was no effect of session for any of our measures and no effect of early versus late within the session. So overall, our prosodic measures were pretty static. What we did find, and I've left this in, is that average measures were different as in the direction that was expected between patients and therapists. So patients are depressed, we're assuming that therapists are not depressed, and patients spoke more slowly than therapists. Patients had lower pitch range than therapists, and they have lower pitch standard deviation than therapists. And all of these are statistically reliable and what we'd expect. But no effect of session, no effect of early or late within session, and actually no interaction between these factors as well. This picture changes a bit when we look at female dialogues. So the reason for doing that is so we have less variation in pitch measures, more possibility potentially of convergence, particularly on pitch, but people have argued that two female speakers, two male speakers, some people argue that they may be more likely to show convergence than mixed sex dialogues. Data are variable on this. So this is eight therapists and 23 female speakers with depression. So then pitch, this is median pitch across the utterance in hertz on the y-axis, and then we have first session, last session, early sample, late sample within sessions. Patients in orange, patients in blue, therapists in orange. And you can clearly see that therapists have higher median pitch, like very statistically robustly higher median pitch than patients. We don't see any interactions. So essentially, statistically, these are one line here and then one line here, although there is a bit of variation there. Pitch range, we actually don't see a difference between therapists and patients, and that's different from what we saw for the full set, where there was some male pairs and particularly male-female pairs. We would argue that the female-female results are likely to be more robust for pitch. And again, we didn't see any interactions there. Standard deviation, there's a marginal effect. So therapists have marginally higher standard deviation in patients, which also concurs with what we saw for the full set of data with males and females in. So strongly, pitch is higher for therapists who we assume are not depressed than for the patients, the clients. Now, maybe this is natural variability. Maybe like we just happen to get therapists who had higher pitch voices. There's only 8 of them. But, well, I guess this is why we have statistical analysis. And although the N is quite small for the certainly for therapists, it does accord with some previous findings and the general expectation of lower engagement with depression, so lower levels of arousal, which tends to be indicated by lower pitch. So that seems at least, a reasonably in line with what one would expect. No evidence of changes within or between sessions. There's a lot of variability. You can see those lines, although they were the bars, although they were not statistically variable, there was some variation between sessions. I think there's a lot of variation within speakers. Also thinking about convergence outside of the depression literature, there's a lack of consensus about convergence on pitch measures. So, maybe more work to be done there, but certainly we can say that there's not something jumping out about pitch convergence. We were interested in, was there an association, either in the first session or the last session, between how depressed an individual speaker was and any of the pitch measures? So a straightforward like correlation, more depressed, was that associated with higher pitch, lower pitch? We're also interested in that for the therapists as well. So we looked for correlations between our pitch measures and the PHQ-9 scores in the first session and the last session. And for female-female pairs, in the first session, we found that therapists who were talking to more depressed patients had lower pitch range and also lower pitch standard deviation. So higher levels of depression, lower pitch range. So these two negative correlations. So that's a negative correlation as well. That should have a nice sign in front of it there. It's possible, so this is in female-female pairs. So what's possible here is that therapists are actually accommodating to the fact that these people are relatively depressed. And since I started this project, I've talked to various people who are involved in the treatment of people with depression and discussed this sort of thing, like just their tone of voice, colloquially speaking. And people are aware of the importance of their tone of voice, and they're aware that the people sound depressed as well. So you don't necessarily want to sound very depressed yourself, but you don't want to sound too upbeat if the other person is really depressed. So it may be that when people are particularly severely depressed, it's a sort of empathetic sign to kind of modulate your pitch, lower your pitch a bit, pitch range a bit to kind of reflect the fact that you're aware that this other person is not feeling it at their best. We see this in female-female pairs, and it does seem that it may be more likely to get convergence here, convergence on pitch measures when you have speakers of the same sex, because obviously they've got more similar starting points. There's also a general tendency in the convergence literature where people have more extreme values of some feature at any type of dialogue feature. You're more likely to converge to it. So the people with high levels of depression may tend to have lower pitch, and then that's more salient, and a lower pitch range that's more salient, and therefore it sort of draws the therapist into it. So that's certainly suggestive of some level of convergence here. Looking at articulation rate in female-female pairs. So as for the full set of dialogues, we see that therapists are overall faster than patients, and that's very much as expected. So this is articulation rate in syllables per second, first session, last session, early and late, patients in blue, therapists in orange, and you can see that the therapists clearly have higher articulation rate overall. And this is a relief, really, because we would definitely expect that, given everything that we know from the literature. We didn't have any significant two-way interactions between any of our factors, but we did have a three-way interaction between speaker, session, and sample. And when we explored that post hoc, what we found was that the patient rate increases significantly in the first session. There's no change in patient rate in the last session, so this difference is not statistically reliable, but this is. So patients' rate is actually increasing quite a bit, from about 3.7 to somewhat over 4 syllables a second. Typical average rate generally observed is like 4 or 5 syllables a second, depending on what you're doing. So these rates are relatively low. And we're getting a bit faster in the first session. So therapists have been faster than patients, and that's relatively consistent with what people found before. We've got very tentative evidence of rate convergence. So at least therapists speak more quickly than patients. And over the first session, the patients start to speak more quickly as well. Whether that is in response to the patient, to the therapist's rate, and therefore actual sort of dialogue convergence, we can't say at this point. We certainly need more measures across the dialogue to be able to say robustly, this really looks like convergence. So it's actually in response to what the therapist is doing. We certainly know that if you sound depressed and you start in a task involving dialogues, then typically as you get more engaged in the task, you potentially sound less depressed as you go along, simply due to engagement with the task. And this reflects a general sense that the immediate expression of depression can be reduced when you're active in a particular engaging task. So we don't know whether it's convergence or just engagement with what they're doing, maybe a bit of both. What's about an association between severity of individual depression and articulation rate? So again, PHQ-9 scores, that's the higher is more depressed, articulation rate in syllables per second. Here we looked at patient PHQ-9 in the first session and the last session, and looked for correlations between patient rate and PHQ-9 therapist rate, and PHQ-9. We didn't find any correlations in the first session. We found a positive correlation in the final session. So that's contrary to what we expect, knowing what you know about depression. So people with higher levels of depression were speaking more quickly in the final session, whereas all literature and our general findings are saying that people with depression tend to speak more slowly. So that's somewhat surprising. So this is for all patient-therapist pairs. That's a significant correlation. It's a sort of trend towards significance in the female learning pairs. One possibility here is that this is a reflection of anxiety in the person who's still depressed. So anxious speech is often relatively quick compared to typical speech. And clearly, if you're in the therapy, you know you don't feel better, but this is the end of your therapy, then that might well be anxiety inducing in itself. So you can well imagine that people with relatively high levels of ongoing depression may show immediate sort of state anxiety in that context. We actually see a similar positive correlation in the therapist speech. So patients who are more depressed in the final session also have therapists who are speaking more quickly as well. Now again, possibly the therapists feel it's anxious, but there's also communicative pressures as well. This is the last time they're going to meet, but these people are going away like not feeling better. So there's also this sense of, well, what are we going to do next? So we know, if there's a lot, you catch up with a friend and, you've only got half an hour, there's a lot to say, you're going to talk more quickly. You're in a meeting and you're running out of time, you're going to talk more quickly. So potentially anxiety may be an influence here, and also the need to work out a plan for what to do next. So finally then, I'm going to come back to our sort of very original motivating question. Can we see some indication in the speech of people with depression and their therapists early on of the formulation of the development of a positive therapeutic alliance, such as might lend itself to positive dialogue outcomes? Now again, this is very much exploratory. We don't have the data and we don't have the design to look at this in detail, but we've taken here a sort of ad hoc measure of patient-therapist convergence. We know that in the first session, patients spoke more quickly at the end of the session than the beginning of the session. And obviously that was therefore getting closer to the therapist rate, because therapists were talking more quickly. So our measure of articulation rate convergence then is the rate difference at time 1, the absolute value of that, so the modulus of the rate difference at time 1 between the therapist and the patient, minus the rate difference at time 2, again, the modulus of that. So how different patient and therapist was this in terms of speech rate at time 1 minus how different they were at time 2. So clearly, if they're getting closer in rate at time 2, then this number is going to be bigger because there's a bigger difference at time 1 than at time 2. And so patient, the higher number means that they're getting more similar rate. And we looked at the association of that with the change in the PHQ-9 score over 6 months of therapy. So PHQ-9 high, more depressed, low, less depressed. And as we know, people tended to get less depressed over the course of therapy. Here is a simple linear regression. So this is our measure of articulation rate convergence. So higher means more convergence. And this is the change in PHQ-9 score. So initial versus final session. So here, higher numbers mean that a larger drop in depression scores. And what we see is a trend towards a significant relationship such that more articulation rate convergence by our measure, a bigger drop in depression scores. I think it's important to note there are a couple of big outliers here where there's a massive drop in depression scores. And these are actually outside 2 standard deviations from the the typical drop in depression scores. So some people have gone from being really quite depressed to not at all, well outside of the normal range. So we, using a 2 SD cutoff, which is fairly typical measure of an outliers here, if you take those off, then we see a stronger relationship here. So that here we have a pretty significant relationship, such that people with articulation, bigger convergence in articulation rate in the first session have a greater recovery from depression in the final session. So obviously what I'm not saying is, you know, speed up your speech rate to get better from depression. We were saying tentatively, maybe this is an index of some kind of positive therapeutic relationship early on that may help to indicate a therapeutic alliance that might support recovery. There's a less strong relationship, but again, a trend towards the same relationship for all patient-therapist pairs. So the relationship is stronger in the female-female pairs. So, again, all conclusions here are provisional conclusions. I'm not, you know, pinning my colours absolutely to the mast here. I'd really like to do more work on this, and we are actively trying to find ways to do that, because I think it's very interesting. This is very much preliminary work. So there are no clear effects of depression on pitch variables, except for the lower median pitch for patients and therapists in all female dialogues, which is a pretty solid finding. Some earlier studies have found differences from this. I think there's heterogeneity in depression itself, in underlying personality, in individual voices. And I think one thing to note here, it's important and maybe quite distinctive about our patient group, is that most of them have underlying personality disorders. And as we discussed there, many of these people are characterized by problems in social engagement, social adjustment, even when they're not actually suffering from depression. So it may be that some of these speech features are relatively stable. It can be, and I think it's certainly likely to be the case that some people may sound depressed even when they're not actually depressed. And this may be a fairly distinctive feature of people with these underlying difficulties. We do see some evidence that therapists may use lower pitch range when talking to more depressed patients in the female-female pairs in the first therapy session. This certainly chimes with what I've heard from therapists about how they try to use their tone of voice to express, you know, sympathy with the patient's current state of mind. Clearly, as I said, it's a balance between sounding overly cheerful and sounding very depressed yourself. You want to sort of strike a balance, and probably I'm sure skilled therapists will modulate how they do this even over the course of a dialogue. Articulation rate, very robustly, seems to be the strongest prosodic marker of depression. So we very much expect that people with depression will tend to speak more slowly. We have this somewhat surprising result that both the patients and the therapists, when the patients are relatively depressed in the final session, tend to talk more quickly rather than slowly. This may relate to anxiety and also to communication pressures. It certainly demands another explanation, because we don't expect, and this relates to previous literature as well as our work, we don't expect in general that more depressed people will be talking more quickly. So there may well be a situational factor going on there. And then we see this tentative evidence of rate convergence in the first session. we definitely need more data on this, and I really hope we have the opportunity to get more data. We'd really like to sample through the whole course of therapy. The first session may be a bit special for all kinds of ways. It's the first time they've met these people and they're just working out what's going on. The final session is also special and distinctive for ways already mentioned, particularly if you're still depressed, but this is the end of the treatment. We chose these because we're interested in this relationship between prosodic markers in the early sessions and outcomes at the end, and we have these PHQ-9 scores at both of these points. So that's why we chose those as a starting point, but clearly it'd be fantastic to be able to look all the way through rather than just at the start and the end. And finally, again, extremely tentatively, the idea of prosody-based interventions to actually, particularly when we think about people with these sort of personality disorders that make social engagement difficult, can we actually target prosody as a way of encouraging people to have more engaged interactions? Again, extremely tentative. As I said, I'm interested in prosody. I don't think prosody solves everything, but I do think it's worth exploring here. So that's what we've got. I'm not, as I say, this is what we've got. I've shown you everything we've done. These were the constraints we had, but I think there's certainly a lot of interesting stuff to potentially go forward with this. So just to thank the people who've been involved in this again, most of whom are going to be co-authors on the paper that we're submitting hopefully this month. Also thank Lotta again from York for those very nice examples of convergence. James Manthorpe, who's an MSc student at Plymouth, who did some preliminary analyses, and Tess Saunders at Newcastle, a psychology student who's also involved helping Hannah with her analyses. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laurence. So let's open the room for questions. And online, if there is anything that you see, Nancy, before us. Yes.
Hi, really interesting talk. I was sort of just curious if you looked at the kind of semantics or the meaning of what was being said in the clips that you analyzed. And it kind of stands out to me that in some parts of therapy, you might imagine that the therapist does want to be kind of supportive, so convergence does make sense. I wonder, the idea maybe that you can also strategically use kind of divergence, or maybe you want to challenge maybe the ways of thinking of it. I just wonder if you kind of get this way that sometimes therapists are being convergent, but they can also be more divergent.
I think that's absolutely the case, that people do use prosodic divergence and other forms of divergence as a signaling mechanism in dialogues, absolutely sure. We haven't looked at that at the moment. So at the moment, and this is one reason why we use this very mechanistic sampling strategy. So we wanted to not take any account of what was in the content of what we were measuring, because we didn't want to choose things that were potentially, unconsciously choose things that were showing what we were expecting. But yeah, I think there are two things here in terms of future work. One is just more samples, and then hopefully where the people are being divergent or convergent irons out, but also looking at speech acts actually relating our prosodic measures to what's happening at that moment, and things like, is this disagreement, agreement, encouragement? Yeah, that would all be great stuff. So yeah, divergence is clearly used in non-clinical dialogues, and I'm sure in clinical dialogues as well. So yeah, Lisa.
Thank you. I had a question about in-person psychotherapy versus remote psychotherapy, because that's quite a big thing now. How much are these kind of, I suppose a question we could ask would be, how much are certain kinds of convergence dependent on being in the same room as someone? Or do they typically, even beyond the therapeutic situation, actually remain relatively standard, even if you're talking to someone online.
Yeah, for obvious reasons. I think there's been lots of interest in this in recent years. Again, I'm working with people who are more experts on convergence than I am. It's not my primary area of expertise. I understand that typically one would, certainly in areas like prosody, you'd expect some attenuation of these sort of dialogue features in online dialogues, just due to sort of channel problems. I mean, if we just think about how turn-taking is affected in online dialogues and the degree to which you talk over people much more than you would do in face-to-face meeting. And a lot of turn-taking, I've actually got a PhD student, Tamara Hoogland, who's working on turn-taking and the influence of prosody on that. And so a lot of turn-taking is signalled by prosody, and it is compromised in that sort of situation. So by the same token, we would expect that the sort of full richness of the prosodic interaction is going to be somewhat compromised in a face-to-face situation. Whether that is like modulated by just how good the channel is and how much delay you've got, I expect it is. So in the ideal situation where it's just like talking to face-to-face, then hopefully we will get back to something more. But I mean, I wouldn't like to speculate on that. There are other things you could say about just a sense of presence and just the general, the degree to which we are more inclined to just feel affiliative to someone that is actually in front of us and to signal that affiliation. I mean, I've sat so many online meetings, and sometimes one does not feel engaged, even talking to an individual person, because you're not in the same space as they are. And so I think the degree to which you're good signal affiliation, and notwithstanding any drawbacks in the channel, the transmission of prosody, I think it's the contextual factors are also likely to make it less evident there. Maybe.
I was thinking of that video you showed us, the little clip where you were talking about convergence in prosody, but also in the physical gesturing, and those people were sitting very close together, right? So that's,
I mean, I think one problem an obvious problem with interactions is the whole eye gaze thing, because you might think you're looking at someone, but they might not be particularly thinking that you're looking at them at the same time. And that can be a big driver of these other kind of affiliative factors. I don't know. Again, more work to be done, although I probably won't be doing that myself. I know there's a ton of work done on the whole nature of interaction online compared to face-to-face recently. Thanks.
This might be a dumb question, and it's very much outside my area. Very interesting talk, by the way. I wonder if you could use this to say a predictive model. Could you, all else being equal with the counsellors, the therapists, could you say, given the pitch of these patients, therapists within this range of pitch will be more effective at dealing with them because of the pre-existing, the closeness of their pitch? Was predicting which therapist is better suited, better paired with which patient, all else being equal.
Yeah, I would be a bit scared of going that far myself, because I mean, for instance, if you think about a male patient and a female therapist, their pitches are quite likely to be highly divergent, but I don't think people would suggest per se that that's unlikely to be a positive therapeutic relationship. I think this is why we get into the domain of convergence and thinking about the dynamics of it. So I think before you can make any strong prediction about where a therapeutic relationship is likely to be effective, you need to see what happens once they get talking. And clearly, if as they say, it's a female therapist and a male patient, or vice versa, they're not going to end up on the same pitch. They're highly unlikely to, unless they've got very similar pitch to start with. So, but are they showing any prosodic markers, maybe an adjustment in pitch or maybe in some other domain that could be useful. Now, again, I don't want to suggest that like prosody is the answer here, but everything that we know about dialogue convergence suggests about dialogue convergence at lots of levels, not just prosody, suggests that it is important as an indication of affiliation. And given that affiliation is an indication of outcomes, then I think it is worth exploring. But I think it does need to be dynamic rather than just like, here's your like absolute starting values. Yeah, thanks for that.
There's a question online, anonymous. So pitch and articulation rate are the two standard features that we can take into consideration when we suspect that someone is going through depression. Is that right?
In terms of prosody, yeah, I mean...
depending on their age and gender.
So we did quite an exhaustive review of the literature, which Hannah in particular is to be thanks to. She really looked into this a lot. And there is a lot of pre-existing literature on what people sound like when they're depressed. So that side of things is not new. And this is why we started with those features, because those are the features that have been explored. Articulation rate really comes out across the board as lower articulation rate is associated with high levels of depression. So depressed people speak more slowly. And that's in terms of articulation rate, which is actual production of speech sounds. So the speech sounds themselves are being produced more slowly, but also in terms of speech rate. So that's the speech sounds plus the pauses. So they're pausing more, the pauses are longer. So both of those measures are slower in people with depression very typically. That would be the most salient marker. The pitch measures, there's a surprising amount of variability. And I think in the literature, so some people are saying even like you might get a higher pitch in people with depression, some lower. I think that's a reflection of heterogeneity in all kinds of levels, different sorts of depression, levels of medication, but also the sorts of tasks that people are doing. Are they just reading, or are they actively engaging with someone else? And also speaker sex and the sex of everyone involved in the interaction rather than just the patient. So articulation rate, absolutely. Pitch, it's a bit more complicated, but certainly for our data with all female dialogues, we see this higher pitch for therapists. And I think that looks to be reasonably, when you control it like that, that looks to be reasonably robust. So a tendency for people to have lower pitch when they're depressed. Thanks.
I might be on shaky ground here, but I was wondering if you could correlate this speech variability with brain activity, the idea that being that depressed patients quite often show less neural activity in MRI scans and therefore have impaired abilities in other areas such as speech acts and the rest of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, one of the many things that I'm not is a neuroscientist, but we were having a chat earlier about neuropsychology. And we know that certain motor speech disorders, so dysarthria is associated with things like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, Huntington's disease, are associated with changes in speech. And typically slower speech rate, that's not true of Parkinson's, which tends to be fairly steady speech rate, but typically slower speech rate. And in those cases, it clearly is associated with neural activity in particular parts of the brain. So typically this wouldn't be in the cortex, but in like the basal ganglia, which is affected in things like Huntington's and in Parkinson's disease, and also the cerebellum. Oh, also, is that another question? Or?
He knows the answer.
yeah, that's a neuroscientist saying no. So the cerebellum, and both the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are associated with control of movement. And as I understand it, people with depression will potentially also see atypical patterns of activation in areas like the basal ganglia. So it's easy to project that obviously it's just a reflection of emotion and just lack of engagement, and therefore he's speaking more slowly. But it may be, and again, this is my understanding from reading other people on this and talking to other people, it may be that actually, yes, there are changes in neural function, particularly in these subcortical areas, that actually have a direct influence on the movement of the articulators. So it's not simply just a disinclination to talk because we don't feel like talking, but actually there are cortical changes in the neural activity. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to look at that. And also, I'm sure there are studies on that already. Thank you very much.
Good. Any other question online? Because otherwise I suggest that we move for further questions over drinks. And thank you very much, Laurence. Yeah. So no questions? No. So thank you.